San Quentin to ADX Florence. California's most dangerous inmates moved to federal Supermax. The transfer order, like it dark, dangerous, and real? Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment now, because once this door closes, there's no turning back. The sirens cut through the fog along the Richmond, San Rafael Bridge just before dawn, red and blue lights bouncing off the steel cables like warning flares. Traffic had been sealed off without explanation. No press, no scanners, no official statements. Just a silent convoy rolling north, escorted by unmarked federal vehicles and California Highway Patrol units running blackout formation. At the center of it all was a reinforced transport van, matte gray, armored, anonymous. Inside sat a man the state of California no longer trusted itself to hold. His name had been scrubbed from the manifest. San Quentin State Prison woke up that morning missing one of its most dangerous inmates, and almost no one knew it had happened. For decades, San Quentin had been the final stop. Death row, a place where time slowed to a crawl and men aged into ghosts behind thick concrete and iron bars. The inmate being moved had lived there for 11 years, long enough to learn every shift change, every echo in the tears, every weakness in routine. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. That was what made him terrifying. Correctional officers referred to him in fragments, never full sentences. That one. The problem case. Federal interest. The order to move him didn't come from Sacramento. It came from Washington. 2 weeks earlier, a correctional sergeant named Luis Ortega had been found dead in a supply corridor beneath San Quentin's East Block. No witnesses. No cameras. Just a narrow space not meant for foot traffic and a body discovered during a routine inventory check. The official cause of death was listed as medical emergency, pending investigation. But the autopsy told a different story. Ortega hadn't collapsed. He'd been waiting. That was when the sealed files were opened. Special Agent Mara Klein of the Department of Justice arrived the same night the autopsy report landed. She didn't wear a badge on her belt. She didn't announce herself. She met the warden in a closed office and slid a thin folder across the desk. Inside were transcripts, financial records, intercepted letters, and surveillance photos spanning 3 states and 2 federal agencies. What they suggested was unthinkable. From inside San Quentin, someone had been orchestrating violence far beyond its walls. Not ordering hits in the traditional sense. No phone calls, no obvious messages, but nudging events into motion. A parole hearing delayed here. A witness intimidated there. A transfer rerouted. The system itself was being manipulated quietly, efficiently, and every thread led back to the same cell. ADX Florence wasn't mentioned out loud at first. It didn't need to be. Everyone in that room knew what it meant. The federal Supermax in Colorado was where the government buried problems it couldn't solve. A place designed to break communication, routine, and influence. If an inmate was being sent there, it meant one thing. The state had lost control. The transfer was classified as a medical relocation to avoid attention. No public logs. No advance notice to staff outside a need-to-know circle. Even the transport team wasn't told who they were moving until minutes before extraction. The inmate was taken from his cell at 3:17 a.m., wrists shackled, ankles chained, a black hood pulled low over his face. He didn't resist. That was what unsettled the officers most. As the convoy crossed into Nevada, Agent Klein received a call she hadn't been expecting. A federal analyst in Denver had flagged something unusual. A data packet tied to the inmate's old case files had been accessed remotely, using credentials that should have been inactive for years. The access point traced back to a private server in Northern California, less than 20 miles from San Quentin. Someone knew about the transfer, and someone was reacting. By the time the convoy reached Utah, another development broke. A former witness connected to the inmate's original conviction had vanished. Her car was found abandoned outside Bakersfield, engine cold, purse still inside. No signs of struggle, no ransom demand, just absence. The timing was too precise to ignore. Inside the transport van, the inmate sat perfectly still, head bowed, chains resting against the steel floor. Surveillance cameras recorded every breath, every shift of weight. Reviewing the footage later, analysts would notice something chilling. At exactly 6:42 a.m., as the convoy crossed state lines into Colorado, he smiled. ADX Florence rose out of the desert like a fortress from another era. Low, brutal, unyielding. No towers. No visible movement, just concrete, razor wire, and silence. As the gates opened, the transport team felt the atmosphere change. Sound disappeared. Radios crackled, then went quiet. This was where men were erased. The intake process was swift. No questions, no small talk. A new number assigned. A new cell measured in steps, not feet. The inmate was led inside, the door sealing behind him with a hydraulic hiss that echoed down the corridor. Agent Klein watched from the observation window, unease settling in her chest. Transfers were supposed to end problems, not create new ones. Yet every instinct told her this wasn't over. Later that night, back in California, investigators finally opened a long-neglected evidence locker tied to the inmate's original case. It had been sealed since the trial, marked irrelevant, forgotten by time and bureaucracy. Inside was a notebook that didn't appear on any inventory list. Every page was filled. Names, dates, locations, transfers. And at the bottom of the last page, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, were 4 words that stopped the room cold. Florence was always planned. The silence that followed ADX Florence had a way of swallowing sound. Even seasoned federal officers lowered their voices the moment they stepped inside, as if the concrete itself were listening. The inmate from San Quentin was placed in a single-occupancy cell deep within the facility, a space engineered to erase routine and dismantle influence. No shared walls, no visible neighbors, a slot for food, a narrow window angled toward the sky, 23 hours a day alone. On paper, it was perfect containment. In reality, the damage was already done. Within 48 hours of the transfer, Agent Mara Klein received a call from an analyst in Quantico, a sealed DOJ database, one that tracked inter-prison communications and coded correspondence, had lit up with anomalies. Not messages, not exactly. Patterns. Tiny disruptions in data flow that suggested someone, somewhere, was testing the system's edges. ADX Florence was supposed to be immune to that. Klein flew to Colorado the same day. As her car wound through the barren landscape surrounding the Supermax, she reviewed the notebook recovered from the evidence locker in California. Page after page mapped out transfers, disciplinary actions, staff changes, and unexplained incidents stretching back more than a decade. The inmate hadn't just observed the system. He'd studied it, learned how pressure moved through it, where silence could be weaponized. And now he was inside the one place designed to neutralize him. Warden Elias Crow met Klein at the security checkpoint. He was a man built from rules and restraint, someone who believed in systems because he had to. He listened as Klein outlined the concerns, her voice steady but urgent. When she finished, Crow said nothing for a long moment. "We've had 3 unexplained staff requests for reassignment," he finally said. "All from this wing. All in the last 24 hours. No threats, no notes, just sudden fear." They reviewed surveillance together. The inmate followed protocol. Ate when instructed. Slept when the lights dimmed. Never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, only in short, respectful replies. But there were moments, brief, easily missed, where his eyes lingered on the camera lenses a second too long, as if acknowledging something beyond the frame. That night, a federal public defender in Sacramento received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a sealed court motion from years earlier, one that argued for the inmate's transfer out of state due to unmanageable systemic influence. The motion had been denied and buried. Scrawled across the margin in blue ink were the words, "You should have listened." The next morning, the silence broke. An emergency lockdown was triggered in San Quentin after a guard collapsed during roll call. He survived, but doctors found something strange in his system, a combination of prescription medications he hadn't been prescribed, administered in precise doses over time. Slow, patient, invisible. The method matched notes from the recovered notebook. Klein began to understand the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't a single criminal mastermind pulling strings from a cell. It was a network of favors, grudges, and leverage built over years. The inmate had never needed to communicate directly. He'd planted ideas, nudged outcomes, created dependencies. People acted without realizing who they were serving. ADX Florence could isolate a man. It couldn't erase his history. When Klein interviewed the inmate, the meeting took place behind reinforced glass. He sat calmly, hands folded, orange uniform stark against the gray room. He didn't deny anything. He didn't confess either. Instead, he spoke about systems, about how prisons were living organisms, how fear traveled faster than orders. Why now? Klein asked. Why escalate? He met her eyes for the first time. Because you moved me, he said. And movement always reveals weakness. Back in Colorado Springs, another development hit. A former corrections administrator, long retired, was found dead in his home. Natural causes, the coroner said. But on his desk sat a handwritten letter addressed to no one, detailing decisions made years earlier, transfers approved, warnings ignored. At the end, one line stood out. I thought distance would end it. The media began circling. Rumors of a ghost inmate spread across online forums. True crime podcasts speculated wildly. Official channels denied everything. But inside federal offices, the fear was real and growing. Every incident pointed backward, not forward. The closer they looked, the clearer it became. ADX Florence wasn't the end of the story. It was the trigger. Late one evening, as snow settled over the Colorado plains, an alert flashed on Klein's phone. A secure DOJ server had been accessed again. This time, the credentials used belonged to a man who had died 6 years earlier. The access log showed one file opened, a future transfer schedule, and highlighted at the top was a name Klein recognized instantly. Someone still active in the system, someone she trusted. As she stared at the screen, the realization hit her with chilling force. The inmate hadn't been silenced. He'd been repositioned, and whatever was coming next was already in motion. The truth they couldn't bury the call came just before dawn. Agent Mara Klein had been awake all night, staring at the transfer schedule glowing on her laptop screen, when her phone vibrated across the desk. The voice on the other end belonged to Warden Elias Crow, and for the first time since she'd met him, the discipline in his tone was gone. We have a problem, he said. He's not doing anything, and that's the problem. Inside ADX Florence, the inmate had stopped following his routine. He still ate, still slept, still complied, but he had ceased all verbal interaction. No responses, no acknowledgement, just stillness. It was a calculated silence, the kind that unsettled trained professionals more than violence ever could. Klein arrived at the Supermax as federal investigators converged from 3 states. Every past connection tied to the inmate was being audited in real time. Retired officials, former guards, contractors, even medical staff. What they found confirmed their worst fears. This was never about one man. It was about what he represented. For years, the inmate had served as an informal constant inside California's death row system. Not a leader in the traditional sense, but a fixed point. People rotated in and out, guards, administrators, inmates, but he remained. Over time, decisions began to orbit him. Transfers were adjusted. Discipline softened or hardened. Careers quietly rose or stalled based on proximity to cases he touched. When California moved him to ADX Florence, they thought they were removing a problem. Instead, they destabilized an ecosystem. The death of the retired administrator wasn't natural. Toxicology revealed a compound identical to the one found in the San Quentin guard's bloodstream. The method was slow, precise, and terrifyingly patient. Someone was closing old accounts, not in anger, but in order. Then came the final break. A sealed DOJ task force report, one that had never been formally approved, surfaced on an encrypted whistleblower platform. It outlined everything Klein had been uncovering, ignored warnings, manipulated transfers, and a deliberate choice by multiple agencies to isolate influence rather than confront it. The report ended with a recommendation that had been rejected unanimously years earlier. Full exposure. Names were redacted, but patterns weren't. Journalists connected the dots within hours. By noon, the story was everywhere. Headlines didn't mention the inmate's name. They didn't need to. The narrative was bigger than him now. It was about systems protecting themselves at the cost of truth. Inside ADX Florence, the inmate was informed of the fallout. Crow watched him closely for a reaction. There was none. No smile. No satisfaction. Just a slow exhale, as if something long overdue had finally arrived. You planned this, Crow said quietly. The inmate looked up. No, he replied. I prepared for it. 3 weeks later, the killings stopped. Transfers were frozen nationwide pending review. A congressional inquiry was announced. Careers ended overnight. Policies that had existed in shadows were dragged into daylight. And the inmate? He remained exactly where he was, alone, silent, contained. Officially, The threat was neutralized. Unofficially, those closest to the case knew better. Klein stood outside the Supermax one last time, the Rocky Mountains sharp against the sky. The inmate hadn't escaped. He hadn't issued commands. He hadn't even spoken. Yet he'd forced an entire system to expose itself. The final report concluded there was no evidence of ongoing coordination from within ADX Florence. The case was labeled resolved, filed, archived, but Klein couldn't forget the access log, the future transfer schedule that had been opened using a dead man's credentials. One name on that list had quietly been removed days before the report went public. Someone had intervened. Someone who'd read the warning in time. As she closed the file for good, one thought lingered, cold and heavy. They believed the danger ended when the inmate reached ADX Florence. What they never considered was that the most dangerous transfers don't move people. They move truth. And once the truth starts traveling, there's no cell thick enough to stop it. If this story kept you hooked, let us know what you think in the comments. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share this with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because if you think this case was disturbing, the next one goes even deeper.